I never imagined that life could turn so drastically, that one day I would be standing in the heat of a Texas morning, a 2-year-old by my side, and a past I barely escaped weighing on my shoulders. 2 years ago, I was in a different world, one where love and betrayal intertwined, where I learned the hard way that trust could be both a blessing and a curse. I had built a life, torn it apart, and somehow emerged on the other side with a single truth. My daughter, Alice, was the only thing that mattered. I had left everything behind: Michigan, memories, and a past that threatened to define me. Moving to Dallas wasn't just a fresh start, it was a silent war against the ghosts that followed me. But even as I settled into this new reality, I knew one thing for certain. History had a way of catching up no matter how far you ran. That Saturday morning, the sun was already blazing, even though it was still early. Texas heat had a reputation, and it wasn't disappointing. The front lawn of the new suburban Dallas home was wildly overgrown, almost unrecognizable as a yard. The mower's engine roared to life with a single pull, the familiar sound breaking the quiet. Nearby, a 2-year-old girl sat secured in her car seat on the porch, observing with a quiet curiosity. She was positioned safely, away from the edge but still in the shade, close enough to see everything. Her presence was always a priority, a constant anchor in every decision. 2 years earlier, the idea of being a single father in a new state, rebuilding life from scratch, would have seemed impossible. Yet here it was, a reality. The weight of it all felt heavy, not just emotionally, but physically. Mowing the lawn at 29 felt vastly different from the effortless summers of youth, when cutting grass for neighbors was both easy and profitable. Now, halfway through a much smaller patch, exhaustion had already set in. The approach of another person went unnoticed at first. By the time awareness kicked in, she was only a few feet away. Instinct tightened muscles, a split-second reaction conditioned by the need to always be ready. Ready to fight, ready to run, ready to protect. A packed bag in the Mustang held essential documents and supplies, always prepared for an abrupt departure. This time, though, there was no real threat. A woman stood there, smiling, exuding an effortless confidence. She was striking, not just in size, but in presence. Curves balanced in proportion, tanned skin gleaming under the sun, legs smooth and polished. Even small details stood out. Tiny open-toed shoes, nails painted in the exact shade of the Mustang parked in the driveway. There was no hesitation in her posture, no discomfort under scrutiny. She introduced herself with warmth, mentioning her intent to welcome the new neighbor. She acknowledged the effort being put into the yard and casually extended an invitation for dinner later that evening, offering help with settling in. The interaction remained brief but direct. Appreciation was shown, though maintaining eye contact proved slightly challenging. A tray in her hands, carrying 3 chilled glasses, caught attention only as she set it down on the porch. Turning toward the car seat, a proper introduction was made. The child, Alice, called Ellie, reacted instantly. Her expression shifted, lips tightening, eyes narrowing with an unspoken intensity. There was no mistaking the resemblance. She carried the same hair, the same eyes, even the same facial structure. Questions about her mother's features were met with a simple but telling response. There was no one else. It was just the two of them. A flicker of realization crossed the woman's face before she adjusted with ease. The invitation stood, and she seemed even more pleased by the revelation. She then gestured toward the tray, mentioning a refreshment brought specifically for the heat. But just as the words left her mouth, something shifted. The world seemed to pause. The air became unnervingly still. Even the birds had gone quiet. Without warning, Ellie's face turned red, her small hands reaching desperately. Her cries were sharp, immediate, urgent. Confusion flashed in the woman's eyes, but there was no time for explanations. The excuse was quick and final. Too much sun, time to go inside. With that, the conversation ended. Ellie was scooped up, carried into the house without another word. Inside, it took nearly an hour to settle her. A routine unfolded, feeding, cleaning spilled milk, following the familiar ritual of comfort, rocking her gently, telling her favorite story, holding her close until she finally drifted off. With her back asleep in the car seat, it was time to return outside. This time, the work went faster. Whether driven by frustration or sheer momentum, the rest of the lawn was finished in no time. Once the mower was stored away, attention turned to the car. A bucket came out, supplies lined up, and the Mustang was given a much-needed wash. Then, just as the task wrapped up, 2 distinct sounds rose above the background noise. Both called for attention. And just like that, the day shifted again. That evening, two distinct sounds pulled attention in different directions. The first was Ellie stirring on the porch, calling out while struggling against the restraints of her car seat. Though she could walk just fine for a 2-year-old, the buckle had always been a challenge, a small but effective safeguard against her adventurous tendencies. As she was lifted free, another sound drifted over from the neighboring house. Soft piano music, floating gently through the evening air. The melody piqued curiosity. It was hard not to wonder if Rita was the one playing. A glance from the upstairs window revealed a striking contrast between the two properties. Unlike the wild, overgrown lawn outside, her yard was perfectly maintained. A well-furnished terrace extended from the house, complete with a sleek jacuzzi. Rita lounged on one of the sun chairs, absorbed in a set of papers, occasionally jotting down notes. Something about her posture and focus suggested she might be grading assignments, perhaps a teacher. The thin-framed glasses perched on the bridge of her nose reinforced the theory. Yet despite the intellectual air, she was impossible to ignore for other reasons. The swimsuit she wore left little to the imagination, accentuating her curves in a way that made it difficult to look anywhere else. Sunlight caught her deep red hair, giving it a fiery glow against the evening sky. A flicker of guilt surfaced, a realization that the earlier interaction had been unfair to her. The tension from the day had little to do with Rita and everything to do with the past. Ellie's familiar phrase snapped attention back. She repeated the word hungry in her small, determined voice, mirroring what she had just heard. Without hesitation, she was scooped up, and together they headed toward the backyard. A firm knock against the wooden fence was followed by a loud greeting. Moments later, the sound of something being dragged echoed from the other side. Then, above the fence, Rita's face appeared, framed by her tousled hair and amused expression. Her smile was teasing, her nose wrinkling slightly in a way that was unexpectedly endearing. The warm brown of her eyes, large and expressive, made it difficult to look away. She acknowledged the call, asking if the music was too loud before noting the lingering gaze with playful curiosity. Words came quickly, an apology for the earlier behavior. It hadn't been about her at all, just a moment of being pulled too deep into the past. Rita, seemingly unbothered, reassured that no offense had been taken. She was familiar with how different people reacted to her, and it didn't seem to weigh on her much. With the air cleared, a casual mention of dinner followed. Though she had only extended an invitation earlier, it was accepted as a firm plan. Before she could argue, Ellie was passed over the fence. Rita caught her with surprise but amusement, her laughter ringing out as her new neighbor climbed over right after. Joking about the urgency of their hunger, she left to change while the grill was prepared. It was a simple setup, small, gas-powered, missing a starter button, but easy to light manually. By the time flames flickered to life, Rita returned with steaks and corn, already seasoned and marinated, as though she had anticipated their arrival all along. Meanwhile, Ellie had discovered something far more interesting. At the edge of the terrace, curled up on a plush pillow, was a large cat. With toddler enthusiasm, she made her introduction, declaring both her name and the cat's in the same breath. Kneeling beside it, she stroked its fur, giggling at the softness beneath her small fingers. Rita reassured that the cat was old and gentle, unlikely to do anything but tolerate the attention. With dinner on the grill, the three of them settled in, the evening unfolding with an ease that felt surprisingly natural. Conversation flowed effortlessly, the teasing exchanges hinting at an immediate connection. Something about her openness made it easy to get lost in the depth of her gaze, the warmth of her laughter making it difficult to resist the pull of attraction. At one point, a trip back home was necessary to grab Ellie's favorite meal, chicken nuggets, applesauce, and green beans. The last item usually required distraction or deep hunger to be accepted. Yet, for the first time, she showed no interest in leaving. Instead, she clung to her new feline friend, firmly rejecting the suggestion of going home. The declaration was clear. She was staying. It was an unfamiliar moment being chosen second to something else. The realization must have been obvious because Rita reassured that Ellie would be fine in the few minutes it took to retrieve her food. There was no need for worry. Trust didn't come easily, but something about Rita made it feel different. For the first time in a long while, it seemed like trust might not be such a risk after all. As I prepared to climb back over the fence, Rita's laughter rang out behind me. I turned, and the amusement in her brown eyes caught me off guard. There was something about the way she looked at me, the way her expression softened with genuine delight, that sent an unexpected warmth through my chest. She teased me, pointing out that it might be easier to use the gate rather than making a spectacle of myself. Confused, I glanced around, and sure enough, there it was, just a few feet away. Even more embarrassingly, she revealed that my own gate was positioned just across from hers, something I had completely overlooked. Shaking my head at my own obliviousness, I walked through the gate like a normal person this time. I made it home, grabbed everything Ellie needed for dinner, and hurried back. As she ate, Rita and I continued talking, our conversation flowing easily. She opened up about her past, growing up in Florida in what she described as an ordinary family. Nothing about her felt ordinary, but I kept that thought to myself. She admitted that finding a job after college had been nearly impossible, leading her into modeling, though not the glamorous kind. Most of it had been lingerie work, something that embarrassed her more than she wanted to admit. The money had been good, but the moment she had a chance to leave, she took it. Now, she worked as an editor for a women's lifestyle magazine, a career that allowed her to finally use the degree she had worked so hard to earn. She must have noticed the way I was looking at her because she waved a hand in front of my face and joked that she must have bored me to sleep. I shook my head, unable to hold back a smile, and told her the truth, that I was just mesmerized by her. At first, she laughed, but then something shifted. The light in her eyes dimmed, and a single tear slid down her cheek. Before I could say anything, she changed the subject, pointing out that the steaks were ready. Ellie had already drifted off, one small arm resting on the cat she had so proudly befriended. Seeing her curled up there, so content, made it clear that dinner would have to move inside. Rita suggested I put my daughter to bed while she handled the food. I carried Ellie home, settling her into bed with her favorite stuffed animal, leaving the door open just enough and switching on the hallway light, as I always did. Though she no longer needed the baby monitor, I kept it on out of habit. Expecting to find Rita in the kitchen, I was surprised to see her instead in the living room, sitting on the couch in front of the fireplace. I had never given much thought to why a house in Texas needed a fireplace, but now, as the flames flickered and cast a warm glow over the room, I realized it wasn't about necessity. It was about moments like this. She asked if we could light it, pouting slightly, and in that instant, I knew I would never be able to refuse her anything. A few minutes later, we sat in the dim room, the fire the only light between us. The air conditioning kept the Texas heat at bay, preventing the warmth of the flames from being overwhelming. The atmosphere was undeniably intimate. She sighed, commenting on how romantic it all felt, but then she hesitated before adding that it also made things harder. She made it clear, whatever I might have been hoping for tonight wouldn't happen. She wasn't ready. Leaning her head against my shoulder, she confessed that there were things she hadn't told me yet. She spoke about how hard it had been after college, how every job offer seemed to come with a paycheck too small to survive on. Modeling had been a way out, but the industry wasn't kind. She had trusted the wrong people, believing in promises that never held any weight. Then, there was the man who had hurt her the most. He had seemed different, old-fashioned, the kind of man who talked about the future as if it was something they would build together. After a year of dating, he proposed. She believed in him, gave him everything she had, and thought she was finally where she was meant to be. But the morning after their first night together, everything changed. At work, she realized she had become a joke. He had told everyone. The men in her office made snide remarks, whispered things she didn't understand at first. Then, she learned the truth. He had recorded them, without her knowledge. The video had made its rounds before she even knew it existed. By the time she found out, the damage was done. She had to fight to get it taken down, but the betrayal had left permanent scars. Since then, she hadn't trusted anyone. She called herself a fat cow, as if that somehow explained why she had been treated the way she had, as if she believed she didn't deserve better. She told me that people always said men only became cruel after being hurt by women, but the reality was that some men were just bad from the start. Then her words shifted. She admitted she liked me. She could see that I wasn't like the others. She knew I looked at her body. What man wouldn't? But she also knew that I had spent the day looking at her face. She wanted to trust me, but she needed time. Her voice was quiet when she said it, almost like she expected me to leave right then and there. Instead of responding, I stood up and walked away. I needed a second to think. When I returned, she was already gathering her things, her expression guarded. She assumed I'd lost interest, that I was just another guy who thought a woman like her would be an easy target, desperate for affection, that she had let her guard down too soon. Her words stung, not because I believed them, but because she did. I told her bluntly that she was starting to annoy me. A woman as beautiful as her should have more confidence. When she raised an eyebrow, asking where exactly I thought her place was, I answered without hesitation, right next to me, wherever I was. The smile that broke across her face in that moment was like nothing I had ever seen. It wasn't flirtatious or teasing, it was real, unguarded. As the fire crackled between us, she took a step forward, closing the distance. I watched the fire flicker, its glow casting shadows across the room. Rita's expression was vulnerable, hesitant. She had trusted me enough to share her past, but she still carried the weight of betrayal. I reassured her that not everyone she met would hurt her, and that she deserved to trust again. To prove my own trust, I told her why I'd left the room earlier. Checking on Ellie was second nature to me. I did it every night, sometimes waking up just to make sure she was safe. It wasn't something I thought about. It was just part of me. Opening up further, I shared my own past. I worked as a civil engineer, still adapting to my role in Dallas after starting my career in Michigan. At 29, I had taken longer than most to settle into my profession. College had started with a singular focus: football. I had spent my first 2 years convinced I was destined for the NFL, never considering a backup plan. Then, an injury sidelined me, and reality hit. My chances of going pro had never been real. Accepting that truth took time. I had spent 15 years devoted to the game, only to realize I had been another overhyped player who wouldn't have made it. With 2 wasted years behind me, I finally shifted my focus to academics, throwing myself into engineering. After graduation, I stayed in Michigan, drawn to its seasons, lakes, and crisp autumn air. But I knew I wouldn't be going back anytime soon. 2 years into my job, I was sent to oversee a freeway expansion project near Detroit. My team was tasked with rerouting utilities, marking gas lines and underground systems before construction could begin. That's when I met her. She lived in a small ranch house on the edge of the project site. On the first day, she stood on her porch, cigarette in hand, watching us work. At first, she seemed ordinary, mid-30s, shoulder-length brown hair, glasses, heavy eye makeup that didn't quite fit. But there was something unnerving about the way she observed me. Even when I met her gaze, she didn't look away. As the team mapped the area, she approached, asking about our work. There was a boldness in the way she moved, standing closer than necessary. At one point, she disappeared inside and returned with a glass, offering what she called her famous lemonade. The heat was brutal, and I accepted without hesitation. It was surprisingly good. When she offered a second glass, I hesitated, not wanting to impose, but she insisted. The moment she stepped inside, my crew started laughing. My foreman, Mac, wasted no time making jokes, nudging me about how the old maid was clearly interested. I pointed out she wasn't that old, only 32, which only made them laugh harder. Throughout the day, she found excuses to stay in my line of sight, stretching, adjusting her shirt, making sure I noticed her. For a young guy living alone, the attention was hard to ignore. When it was time to wrap up, she extended an invitation, casually mentioning that she hated eating dinner alone. There were no expectations, just an offer to share a meal. The teasing from my crew continued all the way back to the office, but they had no idea she had invited me over. Despite their jokes, I found myself driving back after work. Maybe it was loneliness or maybe curiosity, but a home-cooked meal and the possibility of something more was hard to turn down. When I arrived, she was already waiting on the porch. Without a word, she reached into a cooler and pulled out another glass of lemonade, as if she had been sure I would come back. Taking a sip, I asked why she called it famous. Her answer was simple. People liked to believe they had something unique to offer, something that made them special. In the grand scheme of things, she was just another person in the world. But there were 2 things she knew she was undeniably good at. Before I could ask, she answered, lemonade and closeness. The bluntness caught me completely off guard. She said it as casually as someone commenting on the weather. I nearly choked on my drink. She watched me with amusement, then pointed out that I had already tried the lemonade. The real question was whether I wanted to try the other thing. Morning arrived too soon. Half asleep, I muttered that work started at 9. She pointed out we still had a couple of hours. But by 7:30, I was out the door, heading home to shower. Before I left, she asked when I'd be back. It caught me off guard. I hadn't actually planned on returning. But she smiled, reminding me that last night had been something special. With no better plans, I agreed to dinner. At my apartment, exhaustion weighed on me, but underneath it, there was a buzz of energy. It had been the kind of night men don't forget. At work, I kept quiet, lost in thought. In daylight, something about it unsettled me. She had dodged every personal question, shifting the conversation whenever I tried to learn more. Either she was hiding something, or, like me, she wasn't looking for anything serious. It made sense. She was older, had her own home, and was established. What would she want with a guy like me? But logic didn't stop me from looking forward to seeing her again. When I arrived at her house, the last thing I expected was for a beautiful young woman to answer the door. She looked my age, maybe younger. We stared at each other until Leanne appeared, grabbing my hand and introducing me to her daughter. I scrambled to recover, joking that she didn't look old enough to have a daughter that age. She laughed, correcting me. Her daughter was 20. As we stepped onto the porch, two boys around 7 and 10 ran past us into the house. I hesitated before asking if they were hers too. She nodded with a smile. Then she dropped the real bomb. She had 5 kids. 2 were away for the summer, but would be back in a few weeks. Shock left me speechless, but she breezed past it, telling me to start the grill. Her daughter left, and I got to work, grilling steaks for us and burgers for the boys. As the evening unfolded, I found myself settling into an unexpected rhythm. The boys had endless energy, full of questions, eager to learn how to throw a football. Later, Leanne brought out sparklers, and I lit them while they ran around laughing. Hide and seek followed, and each time they got close, I jumped out, sending them screaming back to the porch, only for them to beg to do it again. By bedtime, I almost felt disappointed. Leanne returned, smiling, saying she hadn't seen them this happy since their father passed. I wanted to ask about him, to understand more, but she steered the conversation elsewhere. What started as a no-strings arrangement quickly turned into something more. I recognized comfort when I felt it. And coming home to Leanne, spending nights with her and time with her kids, was better than sitting alone in my apartment. My single friends spent their nights in bars, hoping for a rare, lucky moment. I had something real. I never said it out loud, but I knew I was in love with her. I contributed to the household, always bringing something for the kids. They became part of my life, just like she had. The only problem was Jean. She resented me, always questioning why I was with someone so much older. At first, I dismissed it, telling her she should be happy if she loved her mother, but her hostility never faded. She watched me when Leanne wasn't looking, testing boundaries. One night, she finally spoke openly, suggesting I was in the wrong bed. When I reminded her she wasn't interested in men, she smirked and said there's always a first time. She insisted that while her mother could enjoy me for now, I would eventually be hers. Her words sent a chill down my spine. She made it clear, whatever her mother could offer, she could do better, younger, fresher. That night, Leanne seemed troubled. When I asked what was wrong, she hesitated before saying she didn't want things to end, that she would miss this. The way she said it made my stomach drop. Then she told me she was pregnant. Silence stretched between us. The baby was mine. It must have happened early on. She hadn't been with anyone else since her husband died. She tried to reassure me, saying I didn't have to be responsible, that I could see the child whenever I wanted. But my decision was already made. I wasn't leaving. I loved her. I loved her kids, and now I loved the child she carried. We would figure it out. A bigger house was our next step. The next 7 months were some of the happiest of my life. Leanne and I grew closer, truly becoming a family. But one problem remained, Jean. She didn't hide her resentment, whispering that she should have been the one carrying my child, that no man had ever stayed with her mother like I had, even as Leanne's pregnancy progressed. Her anger simmered beneath the surface, but I ignored it. When the time came for Leanne to give birth, excitement and fear battled inside me. She insisted I be in the delivery room, and after some debate, they allowed it. But when things got intense, I blacked out. By the time I woke up, it was over. A nurse laughed at my embarrassment as I asked to see Leanne and our baby. She looked exhausted, but to me, she had never been more beautiful. Then she broke the news. Our son wasn't a son. We had a daughter. We named her Alice, after my mother, and the moment I held her, my world shifted. I knew what I had to do. But life kept moving, and it wasn't until 6 months later that I finally bought Leanne a ring. I wanted us to be a real family. Thinking Johnny might offer insight, I showed her the ring. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. Tears filled her eyes as she told me to take it back, that I should be marrying her instead. Something about her words unsettled me, but I pushed forward. One Wednesday afternoon, I left work early, bought flowers, and headed home. The house was quiet. Jean was out, and the kids were at school. I checked on Ellie, sleeping peacefully in her crib. The connection I felt with her was undeniable, but today, My focus was on her mother. Then I heard a noise from the bedroom. At first, I thought Leanne was moving furniture, but when I opened the door, I walked into a nightmare. She wasn't alone. Two of our married neighbors were with her. Everything blurred. The first thing I remember was the sound of flowers hitting the floor as they slipped from my hands. Jean appeared beside me, speaking calmly like she was trying to soothe a child. She told me Leanne wasn't worth it and suggested we go for a drive. Still in shock, I let her pull me outside. We drove in silence for an hour. As the numbness faded, humiliation set in. I felt like an idiot. But Jean's voice was steady. She reminded me that I hadn't done anything wrong. Leanne had. She admitted she had tried to warn me but had also been deceived. She thought her mother had stopped sleeping around when we got together, but she hadn't. This wasn't new. Leanne had been with those men for years. Their marriages, their friendships, none of it mattered to her. Jean even revealed that her so-called stepfather hadn't died. He had simply walked away, abandoning Leanne in a Walmart parking lot, driving off while she shopped. He never looked back. I dropped Jean off and left without a word, heading straight to my old neighborhood. By nightfall, I had rented an apartment. The next day, I called work, took time off, and prepared to move. I returned to the house late, hoping to avoid a scene. When Leanne opened the door, she was furious, demanding to know where I had been all day. I handed her the papers I had brought, documents stating I was leaving. She barely glanced at them. Instead, she insisted we talk, acting like my departure wasn't an option. I told her I had already moved out. She laughed, unfazed. No one was chasing me away, she claimed. Not the police, not anyone but myself. She told me she loved me, but love didn't mean ownership. We weren't married. She had never made promises to me. If I wanted to throw everything away, that was my decision. I could only stare at her, speechless. Then, without a hint of remorse, she explained why she had done it. She had needed to fix the situation, as if my presence in her life had disrupted her routine. She had to come up with an excuse for the wives of the men she had been sleeping with. Stunned, I realized she wasn't apologizing. She was just justifying herself. She had betrayed me, and somehow, in her mind, it was my fault. Leanne never apologized. Instead, she turned the situation against me, twisting it as if I were the one in the wrong. I was too stunned to respond, but I didn't have to. Jean stepped in. She didn't hold back, reminding her mother that I had lived there for a year, paid the bills, bought groceries, and been more of a father to the kids than any man before. She pointed out that the neighbors Leanne had cheated with didn't even know the children's names, while I had stepped up as a provider. The weight of Jean's words left Leanne silent, tears forming in her eyes. But Jean wasn't finished. She revealed the real reason I had come home early. I had been planning to propose. She pulled out the ring I had given her for safekeeping, holding it up as proof. I had come with flowers, ready to take Leanne to lunch and ask her to marry me. And yet, instead of joy, I had walked into betrayal. Leanne finally broke, crying as Jean continued. She pointed out that without me, Leanne would have lost the house. My income had covered bills while she used her benefits to pay off debts. Jean was blunt. Without me, there was nothing left for Leanne but financial ruin. Then she exposed Leanne's plan. She had been counting on filing for additional government benefits and suing me for child support. But Jean had already helped me take care of that. I had filed first, ensuring that Leanne couldn't claim extra money for Alice. And if she pushed too hard, there was a real chance I could gain custody. Leanne snapped back, trying to regain control, insisting I wouldn't leave. She claimed I loved Alice too much to walk away, and that no matter what, I would come back to her. She was convinced that my attachment to our daughter and to her would keep me tied to this house. Jean laughed at her arrogance. Leanne, unfazed, went further, mocking her daughter by saying that despite being younger and more attractive, Jean could never replace her. She was confident that I would return, that no one could give me what she had. Jean met her mother's stare and coldly disagreed. If I wanted another child, she would give me one. If I wanted loyalty, she would never betray me. Unlike her mother, I would never come home to find another man in her bed. Leanne snapped, yelling at Jean to go to her room, but Jane stood her ground. She turned to me, telling me I had done enough. I had given Leanne a chance and she had thrown it away. It was time to leave. She walked out, and after a final look at Leanne, I followed. Before leaving, I stopped by Alice's crib, changing her diaper as she stirred awake. Handing her to Leanne, I assured her I would still see my daughter daily. Leanne pleaded with me to stay, claiming we could fix things, but I made it clear. I would come back for Alice, not for her. The next few days were chaos. I had to buy furniture since I had left everything behind when I moved in with Leanne. Jean insisted on helping, carefully choosing every detail. Shopping after work made my days exhausting, but there was no other way. Every morning, I visited Alice before work, and again in the evening. She adjusted to my routine, waking up when I arrived so I could change and feed her. Leanne, always scheming, tried to use these moments to get under my skin, teasing me like Jean had before. On the third morning, she smirked and asked if I was already sleeping with Jean. I shut her down, telling her it was none of her business, but she laughed, calling my denial an answer in itself. She claimed it wasn't cheating unless I got caught. In her mind, by Jean's logic, we had never been a couple, just two people who slept together. I ignored her, kissed Alice, and left for work. The only thing keeping me from crossing that line with Jean was me. She was closer to my age than her mother. We lived together, and the attraction was undeniable. That night, I came home distracted. Jean had made dinner. It shouldn't have surprised me. She had always taken care of the house and kids when Leanne was too busy with her own life. Her cooking, cleaning, and ability to manage everything had been second nature for a long time. The only thing that had changed was the way I saw her. The new dining set had just arrived, and we sat down to dinner. I complimented Jean on the meal, and she smiled, satisfied with how everything was coming together. Afterward, I suggested trying out the new TV, but she had other plans. She reminded me that she had spent the day arranging furniture and cooking, so she got to decide what we tried next, the new bedroom set. Confused, I mentioned that we had ordered two, one for each of us. She laughed, revealing that she had canceled the second one the day after we left the store. She had known where this was headed before I did. There was no pressure. She reassured me that nothing had to happen before I was ready. That night, we simply lay together. A month into living together, I finally felt happy again. Until I stopped by Leanne's house one afternoon to visit Alice. She blindsided me with news that Jean had called her that morning. It was the first time they had spoken since she moved out, and the reason for the call was unexpected. Jean was pregnant. Leanne, desperate to avoid being a grandmother so young, had begged her to come home, even taking her to a doctor. She wanted my help convincing Jean to take care of it. Fury burned through me. I kissed Alice and left without another word, driving straight home. I found Jean in the kitchen, and before she could speak, I asked if she still had the engagement ring I had once planned to give her mother. She retrieved it, confused, until I told her to put it on. She hesitated, realizing what was happening. Then, with tears in her eyes, she accepted without hesitation. I should have been ecstatic. I was young, had a great job, a home, and a woman who truly loved me. But something nagged at me, stopping me from feeling at peace. Leanne still haunted my thoughts, not because I wanted her back, but because she had hurt me in ways I hadn't fully dealt with. I had made her life harder, reported her to CPS, and cut off the financial stability I had provided, but none of it felt like enough. June, on the other hand, was overjoyed. She reconciled with her mother, and together they planned the biggest wedding we could afford. She was floating on a cloud. But something was off. Alice was always on my mind. I hated that she lived with Leanne, just another child in a house full of them, while she should have been with me. Leanne had used her for benefits, but to me, Alice was everything. Eventually, Leanne agreed to put Alice in daycare if I paid half. I chose a place she deemed too expensive, so I covered the full cost. My long-term plan was simple. Once Gina and I were married, Alice would live with us. It would be my final act of revenge against Leanne, the one thing that would truly break her. But my world came crashing down a month later. That afternoon, I came home early to take Jean to see the church she had fallen in love with for our wedding. She was waiting on the porch, her small baby bump beginning to show. As usual, she was more interested in staying in than heading to the church, but I convinced her to go. The church was perfect, until we found out the price. It was one of the smallest venues we had looked at, yet significantly more expensive. The priest seemed more like a businessman than a man of faith, but Jean wanted it, so I agreed. After dropping her off, I returned later that night, planning for a quiet evening together. Before heading upstairs, I grabbed a sandwich and overheard Jean talking on the phone. Curiosity got the best of me, and I picked up the extension. She was talking to Leanne. At first, it was about the wedding, the church, small details I didn't care about. But then, without warning, the conversation shifted. Jean admitted she was worried that I would figure out the baby wasn't mine. Leanne laughed it off, saying men were stupid. As long as Jean kept sleeping with me, I'd believe whatever I wanted to believe. Even at the hospital, when people started commenting on how the baby looked like me, I'd be convinced. She mocked me, calling me an idiot, Just like with Alice, because I wasn't even Alice's father. Leanne admitted she had taken a pregnancy test just hours before we met. She'd already been pregnant. Yet I had been so blind that I willingly signed up for child support, even paying extra for daycare. Jean was hesitant, guilt creeping into her voice. She called it bad karma. Leanne dismissed it, reminding her that she had warned her about Ronnie, the real father. He had no job, no future. Staying with him would have meant having nothing. If Jean still wanted to sleep with him, that was fine, as long as she kept me happy. Then came the final betrayal. Leanne demanded her cut of the money I was giving Jean. She wanted a share of the wedding funds. My grip tightened on the phone. It took everything in me to hang up quietly and walk away without losing control. I went back to work that night, throwing myself into distractions. I had spent so much time believing I was in control of my life, but I had been nothing more than a fool. Looking at my life, I realized how much of it had been built on lies. I had always considered myself intelligent, well-educated, successful. Yet 2 manipulative women had outplayed me at every turn. Much of what I had done with Jean had been about getting back at Leanne. I had loved her deeply, but she had only used me. I refused to wallow in self-pity. Instead, I needed a plan, one they wouldn't see coming. One advantage was that neither of them owned a cell phone, something I had assumed everyone had. Jean had pushed for an iPhone like mine, but thankfully I had never bought it for her. I stopped at an electronics store, picking up everything I needed to record conversations. That evening, I was late picking up Alice from daycare for the first time. Mrs. Crenshaw, the director, reassured me, though she had something serious to discuss. She was concerned about Alice's development, suggesting the instability at home played a role. Then she mentioned something unexpected. CPS had received multiple reports about conditions at Leanne's house. Teachers, neighbors, and even other parents had raised concerns. If things worsened, custody could shift to another close relative. Hearing that, I nearly broke down. Mrs. Crenshaw closed her office door, called an assistant to distract Alice, and asked me what was going on. I told her everything, from the day I met Leanne to the betrayal I had just uncovered. She sat in stunned silence. Then she asked the one question I had been avoiding. "Do you love this little girl?" More than anything. That was enough for her. When I picked up Alice, she reached for me instantly, her small hands grasping mine as she happily babbled. Mrs. Crenshaw pointed out something I already knew. Alice only cared about me. No one else mattered when I was there. Knowing she wasn't biologically mine didn't change a thing. I was trapped, but I couldn't leave her any more than I could stop breathing. Back at Leanne's house, she barely noticed we were late. The place was chaotic, the kids running wild, their clothes unkempt. I handed her son Terry some money to get McDonald's for everyone. Then Leanne approached, acting like nothing had happened, claiming the house was falling apart without my help. She suggested I hire her as a nanny and housekeeper. Her entitlement was astonishing. She had no job, yet expected me to pay her for watching her own children. She reminded me that Jean should come second in my life, while Alice should come first. She warned that CPS was circling and that if I had a better plan, I needed to act fast. I joked that Alice could live with me and Jean. Leanne shrugged. It didn't matter to her as long as she got child support. She even suggested I check with Jean first, implying she might not be thrilled about sharing my attention with a toddler. Then, with a smirk, she added that if I wanted more kids, she was open to discussing it. Disgusted, I humored her, suggesting I could switch Alice to a cheaper daycare and give her the difference. Now I was speaking her language. She smiled, telling me not to mention it to Jean. That night, Jean ran to greet me as usual, but this time I saw her differently. Her excitement, her affection. I began to question it all. Women don't act like this. None of my friends' wives or girlfriends did. The only other woman I had ever seen behave this way was Leanne. Then Jean's expression shifted. "What happened?" she asked. There was no concern, only calculation. I told her about my conversation with Leanne, explaining the CPS issue despite my promise not to. She wasn't surprised. Leanne had already filled her in. On the drive home, it became clearer than ever. Leanne was still controlling my life, using Jean as a puppet. I needed proof. While Jean showered, I installed a voice recorder on the phone. Then, for 2 weeks, I played my part perfectly, pretending to know nothing. Leanne tried at every turn to mend things between us, and Jean only grew more radiant as her pregnancy progressed. Mrs. Crenshaw continued feeding me updates, eventually suggesting I move Alice to a developmental program instead of daycare. That's when I got lucky. I researched early childhood development and found an expert, Mildred Cross. who happened to be an old friend of my parents. She had recently retired, but agreed to help after hearing my concerns. She wanted to observe Alice's home environment to assess the damage. I saw an opportunity. She could pose as someone picking Alice up each morning, giving her a first-hand look at Leanne's parenting while gathering evidence. The pieces of my plan were falling into place. Now, I just had to wait. When I arrived to pick up Alice, I stepped into Leanne's bedroom without knocking. She feigned irritation, but I knew better. She slept like a cat, always half aware of her surroundings, and had likely woken the moment she heard my Mustang in the driveway. Yet, despite her so-called anger, she made no effort to cover herself. She immediately launched into her usual act, claiming she missed me, and suggesting we could keep our relationship a secret from Jean, or, if I preferred, make it official and tell her together. She insisted losing me had taught her that cheating had only caused pain. I humored her, asking how exactly she had suffered. She tearfully declared that she had lost the best thing in her life. She went on about how I had been her greatest love, even more than the so-called husband who had left her stranded in a Walmart parking lot. I didn't let her rewrite history. That man had never been her husband. He had simply gotten tired of her and walked away. She switched tactics, playing the victim. Holding out her hand as if reintroducing herself, she said she wished she had been honest from the start, admitting her real age, her past, her baggage. She claimed she wouldn't have changed a thing about our time together and that I had been the only man who ever wanted to marry her. Everyone else had just used her. I cut the conversation short, telling her that, starting the next day, Alice would be picked up and dropped off by someone else. Her expression shifted from smug to panicked. She asked if I'd still visit. Of course, I said. I left her there and went to Alice's room. Her crib was far too small, but soon, if everything went as planned, she'd have a new home, a proper bed, and the care she deserved. As I packed her up, I heard muffled crying from Leanne's room. Maybe she was faking it, but I had probably struck a nerve. Driving Alice to Mildred's, I couldn't shake the anticipation of checking my recordings. I was certain Leanne would call Jean soon, gloating about how she had squeezed another $100 out of me. At work, I spent my lunch break talking with coworkers about gas lines and heating systems, keeping up appearances. Then my phone rang, Jean. She asked me to come home, but I was too busy. Her response changed. She suddenly said she loved me. I responded in kind. Then came the real question. Do you love me the way you loved my mother? If you could, would you go back to her? I reassured her, feeding her what she wanted to hear. She was everything I had loved about her mother, just younger and trustworthy. I promised her a life without struggle, a future where we had everything we wanted. First, she needed a car. After the baby was born, we'd take a vacation anywhere she wanted. But I had my own request. I told her I wanted to give her mother money. Jean was immediately suspicious, nearly slipping and admitting she knew I had already given Leanne cash earlier that morning. That confirmed what I suspected. They were talking behind my back. I laid out my real plan. I wanted to offer Leanne money in exchange for custody of Alice. It would be best for everyone. Alice wouldn't be just another neglected child. Leanne could rid herself of CPS interference, and Jean and I could build a life with both of our children. Jean hesitated. She adored her little sister, but she knew Leanne would never agree to that, at least not for the amount she assumed I was offering. Then I told her the number, $50,000. Her reaction was instant. That was everything I had saved over the years, including money from my investments. I explained how I had managed to accumulate it, how I could even pull additional funds from my IRA. I assured her that Leanne could visit Alice any time, but she would live with us. Still stunned, Jean agreed to talk to her mother. Then her voice shifted, playful again. She changed the subject, hinting at how a pregnant woman might be easily swayed by a good meal from Texas Roadhouse. She wanted me to bring home dinner, but I knew better now. She was sending me away so she could call her mother. What she didn't know was that I needed to leave, too. I had a tape to change, and soon I would know everything they were saying behind my back. The next morning, I picked up breakfast and waited in the car, listening to the latest recording. Leanne was panicking. She told Jean they needed to find a way to get me back. Jean wasn't interested. She reminded her mother that she had moved out to escape being a live-in babysitter, not to play family again. But Leanne wasn't talking about love. She admitted she was using Ronnie for closeness, but he had nothing to offer long-term. I was the real prize, the provider who could take care of her. She tried convincing Jean to move back home, playing on the idea that I'd love to have Alice close. Jean immediately dismissed it, calling out Leanne's manipulative nature. Then the conversation turned cold. Leanne admitted she still wanted me. Jean, disgusted, reminded her mother that she had ruined her own chances by cheating. Then she called out the truth. Leanne didn't have a heart. Her kids were nothing more than paychecks, and she had raised Jean to think the same way. Jean didn't deny it. She laid it all out. Welfare reform was coming, and the free ride would soon end. Leanne needed to secure her future before it was too late, and that future, in her mind, was me. Leanne tried to push Jean out of the way, but Jean fired back. She threatened to tell me about Ronnie and expose the truth about her pregnancy. Leanne countered with her own threat. If Jean betrayed her, she'd make sure I found out Alice wasn't really mine. Jean ended the call, making it clear that if they worked together, they might still win. But if they fought, they'd both lose. That was all I needed to hear. The next morning, I caught another conversation between them. Jean cut straight to the point. Welfare was ending, and Leanne had to act fast. Jean wanted Alice. She tried selling Leanne on the idea, claiming it would lighten her load. Leanne refused. Alice was the only child bringing her direct cash. Food benefits and mortgage assistance weren't enough. She needed the money. Jean made an offer, $5,000. Leanne went silent. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head through the recording. Then she laughed, realizing there had to be more. Jean admitted there was $20,000 on the table. She called me an idiot, obsessed with Alice, desperate to play the role of the good father. Jean offered to split the money with her mother. Leanne wasn't satisfied. She haggled over the percentage, and after some back and forth, they agreed. Leanne would get 25%. She planned to call me immediately, hoping to shake down even more cash. She never did. That morning, when I stopped by to check on Alice, Leanne was back to her usual games, trying to bait me into conversation, but she never mentioned the deal. Before I left, her son Terry quietly pulled me aside. He handed me a phone number, the one I had asked for. I slipped him $50. "Are you really buying a kid?" he asked, eyes filled with curiosity. "Maybe. Why does it matter to you?" he shrugged. "I just want her gone. I'm sick of taking care of her." "But why would you go through all that effort just to feed her and change her? That's dumb." I asked if their mother ever helped. Terry just laughed. Leanne barely knew which room Alice slept in. At work, I called the number Terry had given me. By the end of the conversation, I had the last piece I needed. It was time to end this. That evening, I returned to Leanne's house, checking on Alice before heading to the basement. I didn't stay long, just enough time to take care of what needed to be done. At home, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my boss. I asked about transferring to another location, preferably out of state. He pulled some strings, and by the time we hung up, my move was in motion. I requested the next day off. The second call was to the number Terry had given me, Ronnie. That night, Jean seemed upset that I didn't want to sleep with her. She asked if she had done something wrong. "I don't know," I said. "Have you?" She swore she hadn't been with anyone else since we got together. I asked about Alice and the money. Even in the dark, I could see the smile she tried to suppress. She faked offense, then defended herself, claiming she had only lied to her mother to get a better deal for us. She had deceived Leanne for my benefit. Then she asked the question that revealed her true thoughts. "Why is Alice so important to you?" She reminded me that we were about to have a child of our own, that I couldn't always get everything I wanted. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I made Jean breakfast, acting as if nothing was wrong. She was thrilled I had taken the day off. Then I told her we were going to visit her mother and invite her to dinner. It was time to finish this. I stayed close to Jean the entire time as we headed to Leanne's house, making sure they had no chance to scheme behind my back. Once Leanne was ready, we went to the restaurant. Over lunch, she casually mentioned her broken oven, and I told her I'd check it out. I knew exactly what I was doing. Then she cut straight to the point. She accused Jean of lying about the amount I'd offered for Alice, suspecting it was more than $20,000. I confirmed it had been $50. She instantly turned on Jean, furious that she had been shorted. But then she shifted gears and made me a new offer. If I forgave her and came back, I could have Alice for free. Jean was horrified, but it didn't matter. I refused. Leanne didn't flinch, asking if I'd be paying her in cash or check. Instead, I pulled a document from my pocket and slid it across the table. She stared at it, confused. It was a termination of paternity rights. I had taken a DNA test. Alice wasn't mine. Along with it was a breakdown of every cent I had paid in child support. I could have sued to get it back, but I wasn't going to. I was done. Leanne was speechless. I told her this was the end. She was out of my life for good. Jean grabbed my hand, swearing she had no idea and pleading for another chance. I didn't believe a word. Leanne, still trying to salvage something, reminded me that Alice loved me. I admitted that was exactly why I had to walk away. Her daycare was covered until the end of the month, and if Leanne stayed out of my way, I'd pay for another month so she could figure things out. CPS had already opened an investigation, and I told her to do better. Jean tried a different approach, suggesting Alice and our unborn child should grow up together. But I knew what she was really doing, just another way to funnel money to her mother. I wasn't falling for it. I said my goodbye. She panicked, swore she loved me, said she didn't need her mother and hadn't known about Alice's paternity. I let her talk, then raised my hand. Ronnie walked up to the table. Jean stared at him blankly, pretending not to recognize him. But there was no escaping it. He reminded her exactly who he was. The man she had convinced to sign away his parental rights. The one she had promised a future with, only to abandon. Now, she would be raising this baby alone. I told her to go back to her mother's house for the night. I'd pack my things and be gone by morning. She sobbed, trying to convince me she had never cheated. I placed a recorder on the table, pressed play, and walked out. The next day I flew to Texas, set up my new life, and got ready to move on. A few days later, Mildred called, telling me Alice was struggling without me. It stung, but I knew she'd adjust. Meanwhile, Leanne was scrambling, trying to deal with CPS breathing down her neck. She even agreed to submit a progress report on Alice, still clueless that I was already gone for good. Ronnie kept feeding me updates. Leanne, still thinking she could use him to reconnect with Jean, let him hang around. She had no idea everything was already set in motion. Within 10 days, I had everything in place. I flew back to Michigan, met Mildred right after she picked up Alice, and held my daughter tight. This time, I wasn't letting go. I paid Mildred for her final services, told her the report was no longer needed, and left town with Alice in my arms. By the time my plane landed in Texas, it was over. Leanne's house was gone, reduced to ashes by an explosion from a gas leak. She and Jen had been too busy moving furniture from my old apartment to notice what had happened until it was too late. When they returned, they were homeless. The landlord refused to let them move into the apartment, recognizing them as trouble. They had nothing left. No home, no options. And Alice, she was finally safe. And they would never find us again. When Jean and Leon arrived at the apartment with 4 kids, the landlord immediately called the police. Since children were involved, Child Protective Services got involved, and given Leanne's ongoing investigation, they took custody of them all. It was devastating for her, but in reality, it was the best thing that could have happened. The children were eventually placed with a caring middle-aged couple who had always wanted kids and treated them with love. Somehow, Alice never ended up in the system. Since most complaints had come from the teachers of Leanne's older children, CPS focused on them, never realizing there was another child. When all the kids were placed, they closed the case. Leanne assumed Alice had been taken, but the truth was, the only person who ever really cared for her was me. With nowhere to go, Leanne and Jean ended up in a women's shelter. Desperate for money, Leanne turned to one of her 2 skills, and it wasn't making lemonade. She was eventually kicked out while Jean stayed behind and the 2 lost contact. Jean relied on unemployment benefits, and Leanne ended up on the streets. That was a year ago. Now, Alice was over 2 years old, and our lives had changed completely. We had started out in a small apartment, but I had saved up enough to buy a home with a yard. She needed space to grow, a safe neighborhood, and the feeling of belonging to a real family. I wasn't sure why I was telling Rita all this. For a year, I had kept our story to myself, never letting anyone close enough to ask. I had done things I wasn't proud of, and to some, I was no better than the people who had hurt me. The worst of my crimes was taking a child that wasn't mine. But Leanne had never loved her, and no one even knew who her real father was. By law, I should probably be in jail. And one day, when Alice was old enough, I would tell her the truth and let her decide for herself. But something about Rita made me open up. Maybe I sensed that she would understand, that sometimes people are just terrible, no matter how good you are. Neither of us had intended to hurt anyone, yet we had both suffered. Life had just led us here. She listened carefully before finally speaking. To her, the people who had wronged me got exactly what they deserved. And as for Alice, she believed love had made me her father, not biology. My so-called crime had given me the responsibility of raising her, and that was a punishment I should gladly accept. Still, she pointed out that raising a little girl alone wouldn't be easy. especially when she got older. I would need help, but she was certain I would find the right person. Until then, she promised to keep my secret. I kissed her. She immediately pulled back, reminding me of her 3-date rule. I apologized, telling her I would wait 30 dates if that's what it took because she was worth it. Something in her expression softened. She accepted my apology and let me walk her home. As we reached her door, she hesitated before asking if I wasn't going to kiss her goodnight. I told her it wasn't a good idea. It was already hard enough to say goodbye. Instead, I asked if we could make plans for tomorrow. She only said, "We'll see," before closing the door. Back home, I checked on Alice as I always did. Just as I was settling in for the night, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, Rita stood there in a long silk robe, clearly wearing nothing underneath. I forced myself to look away. She held up a small box, explaining that she had been thinking about the woman who had broken my heart. That betrayal had left me guarded, suspicious, afraid to trust. Earlier that day, when I had instinctively pulled away from her, she had seen the damage. She told me to light the fireplace and disappeared into the kitchen. I watched her walk away, knowing I shouldn't be thinking the thoughts running through my head. When she returned, she carried a glass and told me to close my eyes. I hesitated, but she explained that shutting out one sense heightened the others. I obeyed. She placed the glass in my hand. I took a sip. The taste was incredible, better than anything I'd ever had. When I opened my eyes, she was smiling. It wasn't Leanne's famous lemonade. It was hers, and I already knew what was coming next.